The first time I realized my neighbor was trying to flood my property on purpose, I was standing barefoot in my kitchen at 6 in the morning watching muddy water crawl across my backyard like it owned the place. And the crazy thing is, at first, I actually tried to convince myself it was an accident. Because normal people don't immediately assume the guy living 20 feet behind them is engineering suburban water warfare before breakfast. But then I saw the pipe. Brand new, bright white PVC sticking out under the fence line like a smoking gun nobody bothered to hide. And the second I saw the angle of it, the way it was aimed directly into my yard, something in my stomach just sank. See, I lived in that house outside Asheville for almost 11 years at that point. Quiet neighborhood, mostly older couples, retired folks, people who waved when they drove by and brought your trash can up if you were out of town. Nothing fancy, but peaceful. My backyard backed up to a slight hill, and technically my lot sat a little lower than the homes behind me. Not enough to matter most of the time, just enough that during heavy rain the water naturally drifted downhill a bit. But for over a decade, it had never caused problems because the drainage balanced itself out naturally. The grass absorbed it, the trees helped, and my old neighbor, this Vietnam vet named Walter, understood how the land worked. He used to say, "You start fighting the shape of the earth, eventually the earth wins." Back then I thought he was just being poetic. Turns out the old man knew exactly what he was talking about. Walter sold the place after his wife passed, and about 3 weeks later the new neighbors moved in. Brent and Melissa Connolly. You ever meet people who somehow seem irritated before anyone's even spoken to them? That was Brent. Mid-40s, expensive sunglasses, always walking around like he was late for a meeting nobody invited him to. Melissa was friendlier at first, but in that HOA board kind of way where every compliment somehow sounds like criticism. Within days, they started remodeling the backyard. Contractors everywhere, trucks blocking the cul-de-sac, stone pavers, retaining walls, raised patio, outdoor kitchen. Honestly, it looked less like a home renovation and more like somebody preparing to host a luxury barbecue competition. I remember standing out there one afternoon while they tore half the yard apart, and my buddy Nate, who came over to help me fix my deck railing, just looked over and laughed. "Man," he said, "those people are either going to sell that house in 6 months or become everyone's worst nightmare." Turns out he undershot it a little. The first storm after the construction rolled through sometime around 2 in the morning. Heavy Carolina rain, the kind that rattles the gutters and makes the whole neighborhood smell like wet pine trees. I didn't think much of it at first. Made coffee the next morning, let my dog Rusty out, and immediately noticed he stopped halfway across the yard and just stared at me like, "You seeing this too?" Water was everywhere. Huge standing puddles in places that had never collected before. My flower beds looked like somebody had dumped a kiddie pool into them overnight. And then I noticed this steady stream pouring from beneath the back fence. Not trickling, pouring. I walked closer, and there it was, that PVC pipe sticking through the edge of their property, dumping runoff directly downhill into my yard like a fire hose. I stood there for a solid minute in complete silence, coffee getting cold in my hand, trying so hard to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe the contractor screwed up. Maybe they didn't realize what it was doing. But deep down, I already knew. 2 days later, another storm hit, and this time it was worse. The water came blasting through that pipe, so hard it started carving little trenches through my lawn. Mulch washed away, one of my garden lights got ripped loose, and Rusty refused to even go near the back fence anymore. That was the moment I decided to walk over there. I kept it calm, respectful, neighborly. Brent answered the door wearing gym clothes and holding one of those giant stainless steel water bottles like he was about to give a podcast interview about discipline. I introduced myself again, even though we'd already met twice. Told him I thought there might be an issue with the drainage setup from the renovation. He barely even looked concerned. He just glanced past me toward the yard and shrugged. "Yeah, the contractors installed a runoff system," he said. "Water's got to go somewhere." I pointed toward the fence. "Right, but it's going into my property." And I swear to God, this man actually smirked a little before saying, "It's rainwater, man. It dries." That sentence right there changed the entire situation for me. Because suddenly it wasn't about water anymore. It was about disrespect. about somebody deciding their convenience mattered more than the problems they dumped onto someone else. I tried one more time, calmly explaining that redirecting concentrated runoff onto another property could actually become a legal issue if damage started happening. But Brent just leaned against the doorframe like I was boring him. "Maybe you should improve your drainage," he said. Then he gave me this little fake smile, like he thought he'd just won something. I remember walking back across my yard feeling weirdly calm, which honestly scared me more than if I'd been angry. Because when you stop trying to convince someone to care, that's usually when the real decisions start getting made. For the next couple days, I didn't say another word to Brent. No texts, no complaints, no passive-aggressive conversations over the fence like half the people in neighborhoods like ours seem addicted to. And honestly, I think that bothered him more than if I'd yelled. Guys like that expect resistance they can dismiss. What they don't expect is silence. Silence makes people nervous because they can't measure it. Meanwhile, every time it rained, the situation got worse. The runoff started eating away at the corner of my lawn near the shed, and one afternoon I noticed water creeping under the wooden foundation skirting. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just annoying anymore. Left alone long enough, this could turn into thousands of dollars in damage. So I stopped treating it like a disagreement between neighbors and started treating it like a problem that needed engineering. First call I made was to a surveyor named Eli Mercer. Older guy, quiet, suspenders, looked like he'd spent 40 years arguing with dirt and usually winning. He came out on a gray Thursday morning carrying this little tripod level and barely said 10 words for the first hour. Just walked the property, checked elevations, took measurements near the fence line and the new patio. Finally, he stood up, looked over at the pipe, and gave this tiny little grunt. "That's deliberate," he said. "Nobody accidentally angles discharge like that." I asked him if I was overreacting. He looked at me like I'd insulted him personally. "Son," he said, "water follows gravity, but pipes follow intention." I don't know why, but that line stuck with me. Because he was right. The problem wasn't the rain. The problem was somebody deciding where the rain belonged. A day later, I called a landscaping contractor I'd worked with years earlier named Curtis Hale. Curtis was one of those guys who always looked mildly disappointed in modern society. Thick beard, work boots older than most marriages, spoke in short sentences like words cost money. He came over, listened to the whole story while staring at the fence line, then finally asked, "You trying to sue him or teach him?" I laughed harder than I should have. "Honestly," I said, "I don't even know anymore." Curtis nodded slowly. "Well, there's the legal way, and then there's the educational way." That man became my favorite person immediately. We spent the next hour walking the yard while he explained drainage patterns, soil pressure, runoff channels, stuff I'd never really thought about before, because most normal adults don't spend their evenings researching water displacement unless another adult forces them into it. What made the whole thing worse was realizing Brent absolutely knew what he was doing. The more Curtis explained elevation changes and runoff direction, the clearer it became that somebody had intentionally designed their backyard to unload the excess water downhill onto me instead of paying to reroute it properly toward the street drains. In other words, they saved money by making me absorb the consequences. And once I understood that part, something shifted in me. Because there's a difference between a mistake and a calculation. Mistakes are frustrating. Calculations are personal. So Curtis and I came up with a plan. And technically, everything about it stayed inside property lines. That's important. I didn't want revenge that would backfire. I wanted consequences that made sense. There's a difference. Early Monday morning, his crew showed up. Dump trucks, gravel, compactors, pallets of stone blocks. The whole thing looked like we were building a defensive military position behind my house. I noticed Brent outside, almost immediately standing on his raised patio with coffee in hand, watching us the way rich people watch road construction near their vacation homes. He walked over before the crew even unloaded. "What's going on?" he asked. Curtis glanced at me, already smiling under his beard because I think he understood exactly what kind of personality we were dealing with. I kept my answer simple. "Fixing my drainage." Brent looked past me toward the equipment. "That seems excessive." Curtis finally spoke up. "Water's got to go somewhere." I swear I nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Brent's expression tightened instantly because he recognized his own words being handed back to him. But he didn't say anything. He just stood there silently while the work started. First came the retaining ridge. 2 feet high, running almost the entire length of the back fence, reinforced with stone and compacted soil underneath. Clean work too, not ugly or aggressive looking, just solid. Intentional. You could literally watch Brent's confidence fading as the structure took shape. At first he acted amused, then confused, then quiet. That last stage is always the important one. Behind the ridge, Curtis regraded the slope of my backyard with almost surgical precision. Instead of allowing water to spread naturally across the lawn, the grade now directed everything sideways toward a long gravel drainage trench hidden beneath decorative stone. Controlled movement. Every drop entering my property would be guided along the fence line toward the far corner of the yard. And that corner just happened to sit slightly uphill from the lowest edge of Brent's brand new patio. Not by much, just enough. Here's the thing people misunderstand about situations like this. I wasn't trying to flood his property. I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I simply stopped accepting responsibility for water that never belonged to me in the first place. Gravity would handle the rest. By late afternoon, the project was finished. Curtis sprayed the driveway clean, packed up the equipment, then stood beside me looking over the yard like an artist admiring a painting. "That'll educate him," he said. Then he climbed into his truck and left. 3 days later, the storm rolled in. A real storm, too. Heavy enough the local weather station started naming counties under flood advisories. I remember sitting in my living room with the lights dimmed, listening to thunder shake the windows, waiting. Not angry, not excited, just curious. Around midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the back porch. Sure enough, water was blasting through Brent's pipe harder than ever. For a second, it slammed into the retaining ridge and pooled there aggressively, almost like it was testing the barrier. Then the trench caught it, smoothly, quietly. The water curved sideways along the drainage channel exactly the way Curtis designed it. Fast, controlled, efficient. I followed the flow with my flashlight all the way toward the far corner of the property where it finally overflowed naturally, directly beside Brent's lower patio edge. At first, it didn't seem dramatic, just pooling. But rain is patient. That's the thing about water. It doesn't care about ego. It doesn't argue. It just keeps going. Hour after hour, the runoff collected against the edge of Brent's expensive stonework, spreading slowly across those giant gray patio tiles like a mirror forming in real time. And standing out there in the rain, watching it happen, I realized something weird. I didn't feel revenge. I felt balance, like the equation had finally corrected itself. The next morning, the patio looked rough. Not destroyed, not catastrophic, just miserable. Thin standing water covered almost the entire lower section. Patio furniture legs sat half submerged, and one of those decorative outdoor rugs was floating slightly at the edges like a sad little raft. Around 8 in the morning, I saw Brent step outside. No coffee this time. No confidence either. Just silence. He stared at the water for a long time, then slowly looked toward my yard, toward the ridge, toward the trench. And even from that distance, I could tell exactly when the realization hit him, because his shoulders dropped, just slightly but enough. Brent didn't come over right away. And honestly, that surprised me a little, because up until then, he seemed like the kind of guy who always needed the last word. But for almost 2 full days, nothing happened. No knock at the door, no complaints, no HOA emails magically appearing in my inbox. Just rainwater sitting stubbornly across the edge of his luxury patio while the rest of the neighborhood carried on like normal. Every once in a while, I'd catch him outside pacing around with his phone pressed against his ear, pointing toward the drainage area like a man trying very hard to explain why physics had suddenly turned against him. Meanwhile, my yard looked better than it had in weeks. Dry, stable, controlled. Rusty finally started using the backyard again without acting like he was crossing a battlefield. And weirdly enough, the whole neighborhood started noticing the tension. That's the thing about suburban neighborhoods nobody tells you. People absolutely pretend to mind their business while quietly tracking every ounce of drama within a 3-block radius. Mrs. Delaney from across the street suddenly found about 6 reasons to check her mailbox every afternoon. My next-door neighbor Travis casually wandered over while I was mowing and said, "So, y'all building dams back there now?" I just laughed and told him I'd made some drainage improvements. He looked over at Brent's patio, nodded slowly, and said, "Well, looks like the improvements are working." The funniest part was Melissa completely disappeared during all this. Before the flooding issue, she'd always been outside arranging flowers or wiping already clean patio furniture like she was filming a home decor commercial. Now, nothing. Curtains closed. SUV gone half the time. Honestly, I think she realized way earlier than Brent did that they'd pushed too hard and lost control of the situation. And eventually, that's exactly what this became, a control issue. Not water, not landscaping, pretty, because some people can handle being wrong. What they can't handle is seeing consequences they can't talk their way around. Brent finally walked over Saturday morning while I was out front changing the oil in my truck. No swagger this time. No fake friendliness either. Just awkwardness. He stopped near the driveway for a second, like he was rehearsing the conversation in his head before speaking. "Hey," he said finally, hands shoved in his pockets. "You got a minute?" I wiped my hands off with a rag and nodded. "Sure." He glanced toward the backyard. "We've been getting some water buildup near the patio." I almost admired the wording. Water buildup. Like the universe had randomly selected his house for punishment instead of him literally designing the entire problem himself. "Yeah," I said calmly. I noticed. There was this long pause where you could practically hear his pride fighting for survival. Then he asked, "So, is there some way to adjust the drainage setup back there?" Not apologize. Not admit fault. Just adjust. That part made me smile internally because even then he still couldn't fully say the words out loud. People will walk 10 miles around accountability if they think it protects their ego. I leaned against the truck and looked at him for a second before answering. "There already is an adjustment," I said. "Redirect your pipe away from my property." And man, the silence after that. He looked down at the driveway, nodded once, then finally asked the question he should have asked the very first day I knocked on his door. "What would you want us to do?" Us. Funny how fast people rediscover teamwork when consequences show up. I told him exactly what every contractor and city inspector would have told him from the beginning. Route the runoff toward the municipal drain near the street instead of concentrating it downhill onto neighboring property. Simple. Expensive, probably, but simple. Brent let out this long breath like somebody had finally explained a math problem he'd been pretending to understand for weeks. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll call somebody." And just like that, the war was over. No screaming. No lawsuits. No dramatic HOA showdown under fluorescent lights while retired people argued about bylaws. Just reality catching up with somebody who thought convenience mattered more than consequences. The contractors came out 4 days later. Different crew this time. They tore up part of Brent's side yard, rerouted the pipe underground toward the street drainage system, and by the following week the problem disappeared completely. One storm later, and both yards handled the water perfectly. No flooding, no rangoon, no drama, just the way it should have been from day one. And here's the strange part. After all that, Brent actually changed a little. Not overnight, not magically, but enough to notice. He started waving occasionally, stopped acting like every interaction was some weird status competition. A month later, he even brought over a six-pack while I was grilling outside and awkwardly said, "Guess we got off on the wrong foot." I remember looking at him, thinking, man, this whole thing could have been avoided if you just respected one simple boundary from the start. Because that's really what this story was about. Boundaries. The moment somebody decides their comfort matters more than your inconvenience, they start testing how much weight you're willing to carry for them. Sometimes it's water. Sometimes it's responsibility. Sometimes it's blame, disrespect, manipulation, whatever's easiest to dump downhill. And if you absorb it quietly long enough, people start treating your tolerance like permission. That's the dangerous part. Not the conflict, the normalization. Looking back now, I still don't think I handled it out of revenge. I know some people would say I did, and honestly maybe they're not completely wrong. But I never damaged his property, never threatened him, never screamed across the fence. I just stopped protecting him from the natural outcome of his own decisions. There's a difference there that matters to me. Because people like Brent rarely learn through conversation alone. They learn when the inconvenience circles back around and knocks on their own front door. And sometimes it's the only language consequences speak fluently. So now I'm curious, what would you have done in my position? Would you have gone straight to court? Called the city? Tried harder to keep the peace? Or would you have handled it the same way? Quietly, strategically, and let the results do the talking? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I promise you, neighborhood wars like this happen way more often than people admit. And if you've ever dealt with somebody who tried dumping their problems onto your life just because they thought you'd tolerate it, trust me, I want to hear that story too. If you enjoyed this one, hit subscribe because the scary thing is, this wasn't even the worst neighbor I've ever had.